Welcome to LSI training for SWAN Portal version 3. This is training module 5, in which we will discuss creating and updating case statuses and the procedure for entering case closures. The outcomes associated with the SWAN LSI program are focused on expediting permanency for children involved in the Pennsylvania child welfare system. Although all data entered into the SWAN portal is important, the date of initial placement and placement closure date are particularly critical for the calculation of those outcomes. Please note that among the statuses available in SWAN portal version 3, date of initial placement is labeled as date child entered care, and placement closure date is labeled simply closure. Let's discuss some of the more notable statuses related to child placement and case closure, and their definitions and descriptions. The date of initial placement, again labeled in the portal as date child entered care, is the date on which the child was removed from their home of origin. That is to say that this is the date that the child was removed from the parent or guardian with whom they were living prior to agency involvement. The date of initial placement will remain the same regardless of subsequent modifications of placement, which would be recorded in the current placement status. In the case of a child who was previously removed and returned home and is now being removed again, the date of initial placement should be updated to reflect the date of the most recent removal. Current placement date and type is labeled in the portal as current placement. This is the type of placement in which the child is currently placed and the date upon which they entered that particular placement. This date may or may not coincide with the date of initial placement. For instance, if a child is moved from a foster home to a kinship home, the date child entered care would remain the same, and the current placement date would be updated to reflect the change in placement. Placement closure and date, labeled in the portal as simply closure. This is the date in which the child leaves formal care and is most easily described as the date upon which the county agency no longer maintains both physical and legal custody of the child. Reasons for placement closure may include reunification, adoption, confirmation of custody with a legal custodian, and others. Placement closure may or may not coincide with a termination of court supervision. LSI case closure and date, which is labeled in the portal as either LSI case closure or LSI closure type, is meant to reflect the date for the closure of a case where a child has either not been removed from the home or who was returned to the home, but their dependency court case remained open for a period of time beyond the placement closure. The most common examples of this would be an in-home dependency, in which the family is involved with the court, but the child has not been removed from the home, or a case where a child is reunified, but the court chooses to keep the case open for a period of time following that reunification. In that instance, the LSI paralegal should enter a placement closure date with the reason of reunification upon the date that the child is returned home, and then enter an LSI case closure date when court supervision is terminated. The reason for that closure would be court involvement ended. Let's take a look at creating some statuses and entering some closures by using an example in SWAN Portal version 3. Here I am creating a new child record for a child named Johnny Lawrence. Johnny was removed from his mother's home on June 1st of 2021, and as the paralegal assigned to the case, it would be my responsibility to create his record. I've already entered his name and date of birth, and we'll hit the next button to move on to the Agencies tab, where I have noted that his county of custody is Beaver County. As addressed in previous modules, the address section is not the responsibility of the LSI paralegal, and you should skip over this section, which will take us directly to the statuses section. An overview of the creation of a new child record is covered in Training Module 2. At this point, to create a new child record, the only status that is absolutely required is the date of the initial LSI involvement. I'm going to say that that date is the same as Johnny's removal from the home, which was June 1st of 2021. We also know that Johnny entered care on that day and that he was placed in foster care. So we will enter his date entered care for June 1st, 2021, and his current placement in foster care, non-kinship, also on June 1st of 2021. If we were not aware of these dates, we could still move forward with creating the record by entering at minimum the initial LSI date. We would have to come back later to add those statuses via an enter LSI activities transaction, which we will see shortly. At this point, I've entered the statuses with all of the information that I'm currently aware of, and we'll click Next to move to the next section of the new transaction. The fifth section is the sibling screen. We're going to say that this child does not have any siblings, so we're going to move right past this by clicking Next, which takes us to our review screen, which shows us all of the information that has been entered for Johnny so far, including the 3 statuses: initial LSI involvement, date child entered care, and the current placement date. From the review screen, we will hit Next, which saves and submits our transaction. After we hit Next, we are taken directly to the LSI activities page of Johnny's record, but if I want to see his child record overview screen, I will click the child record hyperlink next to Johnny's name. Here we can see in the right window under activity, our enter LSI activities transaction that we just completed. And if we want to look at a summary of Johnny's record, we can click the blue summary hyperlink underneath the words child info. This looks very much like the review screen that we just saw, and we can see all of Johnny's information in one place, including the statuses that I just entered. To get back to Johnny's child record overview, again, we will click the child record hyperlink. Now, as Johnny's case proceeds, we will need to update or add new statuses. We can use the make update function to update only those statuses that we have already entered. We will click the Make Update button, and in the drop-down, select Statuses. We can see the initial LSI date, which should really never change, the date child entered care, which should also not change unless the child is reunified and sent home and then comes back into care a second time, and we also see the current placement date for foster care. So if the current placement changes, we can use this Make Update function to make that change in the portal. Let's say that on July 10th, Johnny moves to a different foster home. Perhaps he moves to a kinship home. So we will change the placement type to foster care kinship. And of course, that date is going to be July 10th of 2021. And we can click Save, which takes us back to Johnny's child record overview. And if we just want to confirm that change has been made, we can go to the summary. And scrolling down, looking at our statuses, we will see that the current placement is now foster care kinship, and the date is July 10th of 2021. To add new statuses, which may occur later on in the life of the case, we will have to create a new Enter LSI Activities transaction. To do that, we will click the Start Transaction /Form button to create an Enter LSI Activities transaction. This takes us back to our transaction data entry page where we created the initial record. If the only thing we're updating is statuses, we can skip directly to that section by clicking the Statuses tab, numbered 4, at the top of the page. Let's say that over the course of Johnny's case, his mother was engaged in services and doing well, And on October 15th of 2021, Johnny was returned to the home of his mother. This would be a placement closure, which in the portal is labeled as closure. So our reason will be reunified, and the date we said was October 15th of 2021. Now, if the court were to close the case at the same time, all we would need to enter is the placement closure for October 15th, 2021, and we would be done. We're going to hit next again to get to our review page. And we have our closure date reunified on October 15th. And from the review page, clicking next, we'll save and submit our transaction. Let's say that when Johnny was returned to his mother on October 15th, the court decided to keep the case open for a little bit longer just to supervise. Perhaps they go back for a review hearing in December, and at that point, the court decides to close the case and order a termination of court supervision. Going back to Johnny's child record overview, we will want to enter an LSI case status closure. We will have to again create a new Enter LSI Activities transaction by clicking the Start Transaction Form button. And once we are in our transaction screen, we can again skip directly to statuses. Scrolling down, we see a status labeled LSI closure types. This may also be referred to as LSI case closure. And we're going to put that closure as December 1st of 2021. And the reason we are closing that is because court involvement ended. So this is a pretty common scenario. A child is returned home, but the court decides to keep the case open for a period of time. And once that order for termination of court supervision is issued, the case is considered closed, the paralegal is no longer involved, and we would mark an LSI case closure. Again, if the court case was terminated at the time of the reunification, we would not need to enter an LSI case closure. Simply the placement closure would suffice. Again, I'll hit next at the bottom of the screen. I can hit next or skip to my review window. I can take a look at all the info I've entered, including the closure on October 15th and the LSI closure on December 1st. Clicking next from the review screen saves and submits my transaction. And if I just want to take one last look, I can go to the summary screen from Johnny's child record overview, and I'll see the same info that I saw in that last review screen that we looked at. Here we have everything in chronological order from the date of initial LSI to the LSI closure date. So this is looking like a happy ending for Johnny. But let's say that unfortunately, in March of 2022, the agency receives a new report about the family, and Johnny is once again removed from the home of his mother. As the paralegal assigned to the case at that time, we would do a search for Johnny and find that he already has a record in the portal. So we don't want to create a new record. We're going to want to go into his existing record, which would take us back to the screen that we see in front of us, the child record overview. And we will want to create a new Enter LSI Activities transaction so that we can make the appropriate updates to his statuses. So again, we will click the Start Transaction Form button, enter LSI Activities. At this point, since the child is coming back into care, it would be a good idea for the paralegal to review some of his basic info, demographic, agency. Again, we skip over address, but ultimately we get to statuses. So while our date of initial LSI involvement can remain the same, the date that the child entered care will need to be updated to reflect this more recent removal from the home. So we're going to update that to March 1st of 2022. So a quick note here, when we enter the closure, as we did, the placement closure and the LSI case closure, we leave the date child entered care and the placement date intact. We don't go and clear those out. The reason for that is that we want to maintain that information so that we can measure the time the child was in care. The only time we're going to change those dates is in a situation like we're seeing right now, where the child has come back into care a second time. So the child enters care for this new placement incident on March 1st. And let's say that he is also placed in foster care, perhaps in that same kinship home, also on March 1st of 2022. What we will have to do at this time is clear out our previously entered closure dates, as those closures now predate the date the child entered care and the date of placement. And the portal will not let us move forward with submitting this transaction. So we can clear out any status by simply clicking the red X to the left of that status. So for my closure, click my red X and it clears out the reason and the date. And for my LSI closure type, the same, the red X will clear out both the reason for the closure and the date. So now we can move forward with things as they stand at the moment. Johnny entered care this most recent time on March 1st and is in foster care also as of March 1st. The bottom of the page will click next, which moves us through the remaining sections and ultimately to the review screen, where we can scroll down and see our statuses that are now updated. Date entered care and current placement are March 1st of 2022. Any other statuses that may be added later in the case, perhaps TPR-related statuses or ultimately another case closure, would be added in the same way. We would need to create a new Enter LSI Activities transaction unless we are updating status that has already been entered. Let's jump back to our statuses screen now to demonstrate some of those other options. One thing that is different in version 3 of the portal from previous versions is that TPR status is not designated by mother or father. We simply have a parent 1 and a parent 2. Let's say that Johnny's biological parents decide to sign voluntary relinquishments of their parental rights, and a petition to confirm that is granted by the court on September 5th of 2022. For parent 1, we're going to mark the status as terminated, and for parent 2, the same. And our date, again, would be September 5th of 2022. At this point, we will also want to update our termination of parental rights status to indicate yes, which tells the rest of the SWAN network who might have interaction through the portal that this child is indeed free for adoption. Let's play out another scenario. Perhaps parent 1's rights are terminated on September 5th, but parent 2's rights are still pending. We have to come back to court at a later date. We will obviously update the status for parent 1 as terminated with the date that was granted. One thing that version 3 requires us to do once we've entered a TPR status for either parent 1 or 2 is it to indicate either a yes or no in the termination of parental rights status. In the situation where one parent's rights have been terminated and the other is pending, we will mark that as a no. Let's say parent 2's rights are terminated, maybe the next month at a subsequent hearing. We will enter October 5th as the date for that termination. Our termination of parental rights status will be switched to yes, and the date for that will be the later date at which the final parent's rights were terminated. Let's say this child ultimately gets adopted. We would select finalized as our closure reason, and maybe that happens in December of that same year. From here again, we would click next, jump to our review tab, and if we scroll down, we can see all the statuses that we've entered that are now locked in. The closure on December 1st due to finalization, meaning adoption, the placement dates, and the TPR dates. And of course, from the review screen, clicking next will submit and save our transaction. To close out, let's just review some notes and tips with regard to entering and updating statuses. Some of these we may have already touched on. When a placement and/or case is closed, do not change or reset the statuses related to dates of entry or placement. Those statuses should remain as entered, as they will be used to measure outcomes, specifically a child's time and placement. When a child who was previously placed is again removed from the home, the statuses related to date of initial placement or date entered care and current placement date should be updated to reflect the most recent placement incident. A new status type, such as a placement or a closure that has not already been entered into the child's record, can only be entered utilizing the Enter LSI Activities transaction. Again, an update can only be used, or I should say the make update function can only be used to provide changes of information to statuses that have already been entered on a previous transaction. If an entry is made for either TPR Parent 1 or TPR Parent 2, indicating the status of a termination of parental rights proceeding, the user must also make a yes or no selection for the status labeled termination of parental rights. A yes selection for this status indicates to the wider SWAN network that that child is free for adoption. Yes should never be selected unless TPR has been granted regarding any and all involved parents, or any of those parents have been confirmed deceased. If parental rights are terminated for one parent while the proceedings regarding another are pending, the user should update the status labeled TPR Parent 1 to indicate that rights have been terminated, and update the status labeled Termination of Parental Rights to indicate no. Once rights are terminated for all parents, the termination of parental rights status should be updated to indicate yes. It is important that the proper closure reason is captured for the child. While there are other closure reasons utilized in the portal, these specific closure reasons have at times needed clarification. Finalized applies only to children who are adopted. In terms of the SWAN portal, finalization equates to adoption. Guardianship as a closure reason applies to any child whose case is closed due to an individual being granted SPLC, PLC, guardianship, or any other formal custody. Reunified as a closure reason applies to children who are returned to a parent or home of removal. This would be the child returning to the home of the parent or guardian with whom they were living prior to agency involvement. This reunification may or may not coincide with the termination of court supervision. And finally, a closure reason of emancipated refers to a child who has aged out or no longer meets criteria to be in placement past the age of 18 years. To review in more detail the definitions and descriptions of all statuses and all closure reasons, please refer to the LSI User Guide for SWAN Portal version 3.